The first thing I saw wasn't my grandfather's portrait or the black ribbon hanging by the front door. It was my sister wrapping blue painter's tape around the corner of an oil painting while my father read numbers from a yellow legal pad like he was taking inventory at an auction instead of mourning his own father. "Write down the bronze sculpture too," Franklin said. The appraiser estimated that one at $38,000. Whitney lifted her champagne flute without looking up. Already did. I stood in the doorway with my army duffel bag hanging from one shoulder. Nobody walked over. Nobody hugged me. My mother glanced at me for less than a second before returning to a velvet-lined box filled with antique watches. "You made it," she said. That was all. I had driven nearly 9 hours from Fort Eisenhower after emergency leave was approved. My uniform was folded inside my bag. I had spent most of the drive replaying the last phone call I'd had with my grandfather, Silas Albright. He hadn't talked about money. He hadn't complained about being sick. He had spent 20 minutes asking whether I was eating enough vegetables because Army dining facilities couldn't possibly know how to cook collard greens. That was Silas, the only man in my family who remembered birthdays without checking a calendar, the only one who asked questions because he actually wanted the answers. I set my duffel beside the staircase. "Where's Grandpa?" I asked quietly. Whitney stopped writing long enough to sigh. "The funeral home already picked him up yesterday." I looked around the room. His favorite reading chair was gone. The shelves where he'd kept military history books were half empty. Several framed photographs had been stacked against the fireplace with little sticky notes attached. Sell, appraise, move to storage. Nobody had bothered covering them. Nobody seemed uncomfortable doing any of this. Franklin finally noticed I was still standing there. "Don't block the doorway," he said. "The movers are coming back at 2:15. Not hello, not how are you. Just logistics." I picked up one of the framed photographs leaning against the fireplace. It showed Grandpa standing beside me after my CD promotion ceremony. He wore the same old brown jacket he'd owned for 20 years. His smile looked bigger than mine. Whitney laughed. "You can keep that if you want. Nobody else does." I wasn't asking. She shrugged. "I know." A crystal champagne bottle rested on the dining table beside 4 expensive glasses. 3 were half empty. 1 hadn't been poured. Apparently they hadn't expected me to join the celebration. Or whatever this was supposed to be. My mother finally closed the watch box. "The attorney is coming tomorrow morning to read the will." Franklin added, "Everything's already pretty straightforward." Something about the way he said it made me look at him instead of answering. 10 years working criminal investigations teaches you something most people never notice. People lie with their mouths. They leak the truth everywhere else. His fingers tapped the legal pad exactly 4 times before he stopped himself. His jaw tightened. He wouldn't meet my eyes for more than a second. Interesting. Not proof. Just another observation filed away where I stored thousands of tiny details every year. I walked toward Grandpa's study. The door was locked. That surprised me. Silas had never locked that room. Ever. "When did you lock it?" I asked. Whitney answered before anyone else could. "It doesn't matter. It mattered enough for somebody to lock it." Dad slipped a brass key into his pocket almost too quickly. "Private documents." I nodded once. "Okay." That answer seemed to disappoint Whitney. She wanted an argument. She'd always wanted one. Growing up, she loved winning conversations nobody else was trying to have. She leaned against the doorway. "You're taking this pretty well." "I've had military death notifications at 3 in the morning." She blinked. I continued. "This isn't the hardest room I've ever walked into." Nobody replied. Silence can make people surprisingly uncomfortable, especially people expecting a fight. While Mom returned to sorting jewelry, I wandered through the hallway. The grandfather clock still chimed exactly on schedule. The kitchen smelled like fresh coffee. Someone had left muddy boot prints leading toward the basement door. Too large to belong to my mother or sister. Too fresh to have been there overnight. Another observation. Nothing more. At least not yet. When I reached the back porch, I rested my hands on the railing overlooking the timberlands Grandpa had spent 40 years protecting. Developers had tried buying sections of that forest more times than I could count. Silas always refused. He used to joke that trees made better neighbors than politicians. I smiled despite myself. Then I remembered something. About 6 months earlier, he'd mailed me a birthday card. Inside was nothing but a handwritten sentence. "Never assume the first paper someone hands you is the only paper that matters." At the time, I thought it was another one of Grandpa's strange life lessons. Standing there now, the sentence landed differently. Maybe it meant nothing. Maybe it meant everything. I folded the memory away without mentioning it to anyone. In investigations, curiosity is useful. Announcing curiosity is not. If my grandfather had left behind something he wanted me to find, rushing would only help whoever wanted it hidden. And if that sentence was simply an old man's advice, I'd lose nothing by waiting. The sliding glass door opened behind me. Franklin stepped outside carrying another clipboard. There you are. I turned. We're getting Whitney packed up before tomorrow. He pointed toward the dining room. The antique dining chairs need to go into her truck. I looked past him. Those chairs had been Grandpa's pride. Handmade in Savannah in 1958. He'd refinished every one himself. Dad didn't seem to notice where I was looking. You're late for your grandfather's memory, he said casually, checking another item off his list. But you're right on time to carry those chairs. The movers are busy with the larger furniture. For a moment, nobody spoke. My father wasn't looking at his daughter. He was looking at free labor. I picked up my duffel bag without answering. Sometimes the fastest way to learn what people truly think of you is to let them keep talking. Standing there in the house my grandfather built, surrounded by people already spending what wasn't legally theirs, I had the unmistakable feeling that the most important thing Silas left behind wasn't sitting in plain sight at all. That unanswered question became the one thing I refused to let go of. I carried the last dining chair into Whitney's truck without saying a word, then walked back inside before anyone could invent another job for me. The attorney arrived at exactly 9:30 the next morning, carrying 2 leather briefcases and a portable scanner. His name was Raymond Ellis. I'd met him twice over the years. Grandpa trusted him enough to handle company contracts, but never enough to play poker with him. That distinction had always made me laugh. The laughter felt very far away now. Mr. Ellis placed several folders across the dining room table while my parents and Whitney settled into their seats like they were waiting for the opening bell at a prize fight. I took the chair nearest the window. Nobody offered coffee. Nobody asked if I wanted breakfast. Whitney wore a cream-colored designer suit that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. She smiled every time her phone buzzed, answering congratulatory texts before the meeting had even started. Confident people usually wait for results. People who already know the outcome don't. Mr. Ellis cleared his throat. As required under Georgia probate law, we're here to review the last will and testament of Mr. Silas Everett Albright. He removed a sealed envelope. I was instructed to present the most recent executed document in my possession. Most recent. Interesting wording, not final, not original, just most recent. I filed the distinction away. The attorney began reading. Silas's charitable donations came first. Several longtime employees would receive fixed cash gifts ranging from $15,000 to $80,000. A local veterans rehabilitation center would receive logging equipment valued at approximately $412,000. That sounded exactly like my grandfather. Then everything changed. I hereby devise the entirety of my remaining estate, including the Albright residence, all timberlands, investment accounts, company ownership interests, and personal collections, to my granddaughter, Whitney Grace Albright. Silence settled over the room. Whitney didn't even pretend to be surprised. She smiled before the sentence was finished. Dad leaned back in his chair, so hard it creaked. Mom quietly squeezed his hand beneath the table. Mr. Ellis continued reading. My granddaughter Kendall Marie Albright shall receive my military footlocker from my service during the Korean War, together with its contents, as recognition of our shared appreciation for military service. That was it. No trust, no savings, no land, nothing else. Mr. Ellis closed the folder. The estimated probate value of the estate is $27,483,000, pending final appraisal. Whitney let out a slow whistle. Grandpa always did have good taste. Nobody corrected her. Nobody looked embarrassed. Whitney turned toward me with a smile that belonged in a country club instead of a funeral. You know what? She laughed softly. That footlocker is actually the perfect inheritance. Dad chuckled. She continued. It's perfectly suited for a low-class government clerk. Mom covered her mouth to hide a smile she didn't hide very well. I looked at Whitney. I don't work as a clerk. I know. She waved dismissively. You know what I mean. I do. She expected anger. She received nothing. That seemed to bother her far more. Mr. Ellis shifted uncomfortably. I'll have someone bring the footlocker upstairs. Dad stood. I already moved it. He disappeared into the hallway and returned several minutes later, dragging an old olive green army footlocker across the hardwood floor. The steel corners were scratched. The paint had faded decades ago. One side still carried Grandpa's stenciled service number beneath layers of chipped green paint. I recognized it immediately. When I was 10 years old, Grandpa had caught me trying to open it in his workshop. He smiled instead of getting angry. Some things, he'd told me, don't belong to the curious. They belong to the patient. At the time, I thought he was protecting old photographs. Now I wasn't so sure. Dad dropped the footlocker beside my chair. The heavy iron latch clanged against the metal lid. There you go. His voice sounded almost relieved. I rested one hand on the weathered surface. The steel felt cold. Older than every person in the room except the man who had carried it through war. Whitney laughed again. I hope there are at least some old medals inside you can decorate your office. My office doesn't need decorating. She rolled her eyes. There she goes. The army robot. I ignored her. Instead, I studied the document lying on the table. Mr. Ellis noticed. Would you like to review the signed copy? Yes. He slid it across. I didn't rush. The signature looked like Grandpa's at first glance. Most forged signatures do. Real examination begins after first impressions. The capital S curved slightly wider than I remembered. The pressure points looked unusually even. Silas always pressed harder near the end of his last name because arthritis stiffened his fingers. This signature stayed almost perfectly consistent. Possible explanation? Good day, different pen, or something else. Not evidence, just another observation. I looked toward Dad. He wasn't watching me. He was watching the document. His breathing had become noticeably shallower. Then, almost without realizing it, his eyes drifted past me, toward the hallway, toward the basement door. Only for a second. Maybe less. Then he caught himself and looked away. That tiny movement lasted no longer than a heartbeat. But I had spent 10 years interviewing suspects who believed they controlled every expression crossing their faces. People preparing to deceive usually guard their words. Almost nobody remembers to guard their eyes. I followed his glance without moving my head. The basement door remained closed. Nothing unusual about it, except that this was the second time since I'd arrived home that someone's attention had quietly returned there. Coincidence? Maybe. Patterns require repetition. Now I had to. Mr. Ellis began collecting his paperwork. If there are no objections, we'll begin the transfer process this afternoon. I have one question, I said calmly. Everyone looked at me. When was this will executed? He checked the cover page. November 14, 2 weeks before Mr. Albright passed away. And who witnessed the execution? The signatures indicate 2 witnesses and a notary. He read the names aloud. Neither surprised me. One was Grandpa's longtime groundskeeper. The other was a local accountant I'd never heard Silas mention before. The notary's name sounded vaguely familiar. I didn't react. Instead, I closed the folder and handed it back. No further questions. Whitney smiled as if she'd won something. Maybe she thought she had. I wrapped both hands around Grandpa's old footlocker and lifted it from the floor. It was far heavier than its size suggested, the iron lock pressing into my palm as I carried it toward the staircase. Behind me, I heard another champagne cork pop. Ahead of me, I noticed something far more interesting. My father's eyes drifted one more time toward the basement door before he forced himself to look away. He thought nobody had seen it. He was wrong. Every unexplained glance, every nervous pause, and every detail that didn't quite fit had already found its place in the evidence file I was quietly building inside my own head. I closed my bedroom door, slid the lock into place, and set Grandpa's footlocker on the hardwood floor at the foot of the bed. The room hadn't changed much since I left for West Point. The same oak dresser stood against one wall. The same faded quilt my grandmother had sewn decades ago still covered the bed. Unlike the rest of the house, nobody had bothered redecorating this room. It had quietly become storage space between my visits home. That suited me just fine. I knelt beside the footlocker and ran my fingers across the chipped olive paint. The steel corners were worn smooth from decades of use. Scratches covered the lid, each one earned long before I was born. Near the handle, I found tiny black letters almost hidden beneath old paint. S.E. Albright, Army. I smiled. Grandpa used to joke that the Army had taught him 2 useful skills: how to stay calm under pressure and how to keep paperwork dry in the rain. Knowing him, there was probably more truth in that joke than I'd realized. The brass latch resisted the first time I pulled it. I reached into my pocket knife, unfolded the smallest screwdriver attachment, and carefully worked loose years of dust packed around the hinge. The second attempt produced a dull, metallic click. The lid opened slowly, a familiar smell drifted out. Leather, cedar, not unpleasant, just old. Inside, everything had been packed with military precision. A folded Korean Warfield jacket rested on top. Beneath it sat neatly rolled wool blankets, carefully wrapped photographs, a shaving kit, faded letters tied together with cotton string, and a small metal mess tin that still carried scratches from years of use. Nothing expensive. Nothing anyone chasing $27 million would consider valuable. I lifted each item carefully instead of dumping everything onto the floor. Evidence deserved respect. So did memories. The photographs showed young soldiers smiling beside trucks and tents. One picture caught my attention. Grandpa couldn't have been older than 20. On the back, he'd written only 4 words. Never rush the truth. That sounded exactly like him. I placed the photograph beside me and continued. The letters came next. Most were from my grandmother before they married. One contained a pressed clover that crumbled the moment I unfolded the paper. I carefully slipped it back inside. Some things survive 70 years, some don't. Near the bottom rested a green army notebook. Its pages were blank except for equipment checklists and weather notes. Nothing unusual. Then my fingers touched wood. Not the steel bottom of the trunk. Wood. I frowned. The interior should have ended 6 inches lower. Instead, something solid sat beneath the canvas lining. Interesting. I removed the remaining blankets. The wooden base looked perfectly ordinary until I noticed 4 tiny brass pins set into the corners. They weren't factory hardware. Someone had installed them later. Grandpa had spent years restoring antique furniture. Hidden compartments were one of his favorite hobbies. When I was 14, he'd hidden my birthday present inside a hollow table leg just to see how long it would take me to find it. 3 days. He laughed about that for months. I examined the edges without forcing anything. No visible latch, no screws. Then I noticed a narrow groove running along the left side, just wide enough for a thumbnail. I pressed gently. Nothing. I tried sliding instead. The wooden panel shifted less than half an inch. That was enough. The false bottom lifted free. Beneath it rested a single leather-bound journal wrapped in waxed cloth. Nothing else. No jewelry, no stacks of cassettes, no secret stock certificates. Only the journal. I unfolded the cloth. The first page carried Grandpa's handwriting. Private Field Journal. Property of Silas E. Albright. If you're reading this without my permission, congratulations, you finally got smarter than I expected. I laughed out loud. It was exactly his kind of humor. The next several pages described military memories. Names, locations, daily observations. Nothing sensational. Just an honest soldier recording ordinary days during extraordinary times. About halfway through the journal, something thicker caught between the pages. A folded envelope. My name appeared across the front. Kendall. Only Kendall. No rank. No last name. My hands slowed. The paper felt surprisingly new compared to everything else inside. I unfolded it carefully. The handwriting was unmistakable. Strong, steady, deliberate. Kendall, if you're holding this, then events unfolded exactly the way I feared. They have traded their honor for paper. Do not waste your strength arguing with people who have already sold their integrity. The truth is locked where their greed cannot reach. Take the brass key to the courthouse safe. Judge Carlton Thayer will understand what it protects. Trust evidence, not promises. I have always trusted you because you never confused loyalty with obedience. I love you. Grandpa. I read it twice. Then a third time. Judge Carlton Thayer, Judge. I recognized the name immediately. Years earlier, before joining the county bench, he served as a military attorney. Grandpa respected him enormously. Neither of them handed out respect casually. I looked back inside the hidden compartment. At first glance, it appeared empty. Then sunlight caught something wrapped inside an old pair of wool socks tucked against the rear corner. I reached in. The bundle felt unexpectedly heavy. Inside the socks rested a thick brass key with no markings whatsoever. Wrapped tightly around it were Grandpa's original Army dog tags. The chain rattled softly as I lifted them into the light. His name, his service number, his blood type. Everything was still readable, despite the years. I closed my hand around them. The brass felt warm almost immediately. Not because of the metal, because of what it meant. Grandpa hadn't hidden this after writing that note. He'd designed this hiding place years earlier, long before his health declined, long before anyone claimed there was a new will, long before $27 million suddenly belonged to only one granddaughter. He hadn't reacted to betrayal. He had expected it. That realization settled over me more heavily than the footlocker ever had. An old soldier had spent years preparing for one final operation because he knew the greatest threat to his legacy wouldn't come from strangers. It would come from inside his own family. A floorboard creaked in the hallway outside my bedroom. Someone stopped near my door. The shadow beneath it lingered for several seconds without knocking. I quietly slipped the journal, the note, and the brass key back into the waxed cloth, then placed them inside my duffel bag before closing the zipper. Only after everything was hidden did I walk to the door and open it. The hallway was empty. But farther down the corridor, I caught my father disappearing around the corner toward the staircase, moving just a little faster than someone who had no reason to be listening outside my room. I tucked Grandpa's journal and the brass key into the bottom of my duffel bag before anyone in the house had a reason to wonder where I'd gone. By noon, my mother was knocking on my bedroom door. "You're coming with us." I wasn't aware I had plans. "You do now." She didn't wait for an answer. "It's Whitney's engagement luncheon." I opened the door. "I don't think she wants me there." Meredith adjusted the pearl necklace around her neck. "Appearances matter." That sentence explained everything. Not family, not grief. Appearances. 45 minutes later, we pulled into the Magnolia Crest Country Club, a private estate outside Savannah where membership waiting lists were measured in years instead of months. Valet lined the entrance. Luxury SUVs and imported sedans filled the parking lot. Inside, waiters moved through the ballroom carrying silver trays of crab cakes, shrimp pies, and champagne that probably cost more than most people spent on groceries in a week. I wore a simple navy blouse and gray slacks. Whitney arrived in a white designer dress with a diamond bracelet flashing every time she lifted her glass. She looked less like someone mourning her grandfather and more like someone celebrating a business merger. Her fiancé, Nathan Caldwell, stood beside her greeting guests. Tall, perfect haircut, perfect smile, expensive watch. The kind of man who learned people's net worth before remembering their first names. Franklin moved comfortably through the room, shaking hands with developers, investors, and local business owners. I recognized several faces from newspaper articles covering commercial projects around coastal Georgia. Most of them had spent years trying to buy pieces of Grandpa's protected timberland. Silas had rejected every offer. One developer laughed while patting Dad on the shoulder. "Looks like persistence finally paid off." Dad grinned. "It certainly did." Interesting choice of words. I picked up a glass of iced teas and stayed near the edge of the room, listening instead of participating. Seaside had taught me that people revealed more during celebrations than interrogations. They assumed nobody was paying attention. Nathan approached with Whitney beside him. "Ken Doll," he said warmly. "I don't think we've officially met." "We haven't." He extended his hand. "I'm Nathan." I shook it. "Congratulations." "Thank you." Whitney smiled sweetly enough to fool almost anyone. "I'm glad you came." "No, you're glad," Mom insisted. Nathan chuckled awkwardly. Whitney's smile tightened. "You always know how to make things uncomfortable." "I usually don't have to." Nathan wisely excused himself to greet another guest. Whitney leaned closer. "You could at least pretend to be happy for me. I am happy. When people tell the truth." She rolled her eyes and walked away before I could say anything else. A bell rang gently against a champagne glass. The conversations faded. Franklin stepped onto the small platform near the ballroom windows. He looked energized, confident. Like a man introducing a profitable investment instead of honoring his father's legacy. "I appreciate everyone joining us today," he began. "This is an exciting time for our family." He wrapped one arm around Whitney's shoulders. "As many of you know, my father recently passed away." Several guests nodded politely. His estate has now been settled, allowing us to move forward with plans that were impossible before. I felt my shoulders straighten. Move forward. That phrase rarely meant anything good in business meetings. Franklin continued. "I'm pleased to announce that the Albright Forest Reserve will soon become the site of Georgia's newest mixed-use luxury development." Applause broke out across the ballroom. Several developers exchanged satisfied smiles. One man actually raised his champagne glass. I stared at my father. The Albright Forest Reserve wasn't just valuable land. It was nearly 2,000 acres protected by conservation agreements. Grandpa had spent decades negotiating with environmental groups, state agencies, and neighboring landowners. He once told me that a forest took generations to grow and only one bad decision to disappear. Franklin spoke again. Our legal team expects closing within 60 days. More applause. I set my glass down. Then I walked toward the platform. Every conversation gradually faded as people noticed me. Dad saw me coming. His smile weakened. I need to correct one thing, I said calmly. No shouting, no dramatic gestures. Just my normal speaking voice. The forest reserve wasn't intended for commercial development. Franklin forced another smile. This isn't really the time. It was protected because my grandfather promised multiple conservation organizations it would remain preserved. Several guests exchanged uncertain looks. I continued. He rejected multi-million-dollar offers for years because that land meant more to him than profit. One developer frowned. I understood those restrictions were being removed. So did I replied. I'd be interested in seeing the documentation. Silence spread across the room. Nobody applauded now. Nathan looked from me to Franklin, clearly realizing this wasn't a planned family discussion. Dad laughed a little too loudly. Kendall has always been sentimental. I'm talking about signed conservation commitments. We're talking about family business. They're the same thing when legal obligations are involved. Franklin's smile disappeared. Before he could answer, Meredith stepped forward. She placed one gentle hand on my arm and turned toward the guests with an expression that almost looked sympathetic. I'm so sorry. Nobody spoke, she sighed dramatically. Our younger daughter has been struggling since her last deployment. I looked at her without interrupting. Meredith, Dad warned quietly. She ignored him. The military has been helping her. A few uncomfortable faces appeared around the room. Unfortunately, she continued, she still experiences severe post-deployment instability. The words hung in the air. I heard someone quietly whisper, "That's awful." Another guest nodded with genuine concern. Meredith lowered her voice as if sharing a painful family secret. We've tried everything. She reached toward me. I stepped back. She's let her hand fall slowly. She's convinced her father and sister somehow cheated her. Nobody moved. Nobody knew what to believe. Meredith continued filling that silence. Please don't misunderstand her behavior today. She looked directly at one elderly couple. She's attempting to pressure Whitney into giving her money from the estate. Then she added the sentence that made several guests look at me differently. She's trying to extort her own sister out of jealousy. A quiet murmur swept through the ballroom. Whitney lowered her eyes with practiced sadness. Nathan wrapped an arm around her shoulders. It was a convincing performance. If I hadn't known the script in advance, I might have believed it myself. I looked around the room. Some people avoided eye contact. Others offered polite expressions of pity. Only a handful seemed uncertain. Not one of them knew that my mother had just accused an active-duty Army CID Captain of criminal conduct in front of nearly 100 witnesses. She thought she had erased my credibility. Instead, she had created something investigators appreciate more than apologies. A room full of independent witnesses who had all heard the exact same false statement. I picked up my untouched glass of iced tea, took one slow sip, and set it back on the nearest table. I hope everyone enjoys lunch, I said evenly, and I hope, before anyone signs a contract involving my grandfather's land, they ask to see every document instead of only the convenient ones. No one answered. I turned and walked out of the ballroom without looking back. Sometimes the quickest way to expose a lie isn't to argue with it. It's to give it enough room to become expensive. As I reached my truck, I could still feel the weight of Grandpa's brass key inside my duffel bag. For the first time since coming home, I knew exactly where I needed to go next. I drove away from the country club without checking whether anyone tried to stop me, and instead of heading back to the estate, I pointed my truck toward the Camden County Probate Court. Grandpa had always said that if someone insisted on making everything public, you might as well let the truth enjoy the same audiences. The courthouse wasn't impressive. Red brick, white columns, a flag that had seen better days. The building looked more interested in doing its job than impressing visitors. I appreciated that. Inside, I walked through security, signed the visitor log at 2:18 p.m., and asked the clerk whether Judge Carlton Thayer had a few minutes available. She looked at my military ID. Captain Albright? Yes. She smiled politely. I'll see if he's between hearings. 5 minutes later, I was sitting across from Judge Thayer in his chambers. He stood when I entered. I remember your grandfather talking about you. I hope he was kind. He was proud. Those two words carried more weight than a room full of applause ever could. He motioned toward a chair. What can I do for you, Captain? I removed 3 items from a document folder: a certified copy of the will, my handwritten observations, a magnified photograph of Silas's signature that I'd printed at Copy Center before coming to court. I am not contesting the will based on emotion, I began. Good. I request that the court examine whether the document is authentic. He leaned forward. What concerns you? I pointed to the enlarged signature. My grandfather suffered from advanced arthritis in his dominant hand. Judge Thayer nodded. I remember. Every birthday card he mailed me during the last 5 years showed increased pressure variation. His hand always hesitated near the end of his surname. I slid another sheet across the desk. This signature maintains nearly identical pressure from beginning to end. He studied both pages silently, I continued. The slant differs by approximately 4 degrees. He glanced up. You measured it? I did. The spacing between the first and last names is also inconsistent with earlier legal documents. Judge Thayer didn't interrupt. He simply kept reading. Most people hear accusations. Experienced judges hear evidence. Finally, he folded his hands. Anything else? Yes. I told him about the locked study, my father's unusual behavior, the repeated glances toward the basement, the sudden rush to inventory every valuable item before probate concluded. I understand none of those observations independently prove fraud. But together, he asked, they justify asking better questions. A slow smile crossed his face. That sounds like something a CID investigator would say. I've spent too many years assuming coincidence. He stood and walked toward a tall filing cabinet. Your grandfather deposited a sealed antique safe into court custody several years ago. I kept my expression neutral, so the note had been accurate. He instructed the court that it could only be opened under very specific legal circumstances. My pulse quickened just enough for me to notice. And those circumstances? If substantial questions arose concerning estate authenticity. He looked directly at me. Nobody has ever requested such a review. I am requesting one now. He nodded once. Then I'll need something more than suspicion. I expected that. From my folder, I produced Grandpa's handwritten birthday cards spanning 6 years, Christmas notes, signed business letters, military correspondence he'd copied for me years earlier. Every signature told the same physical story. The question will did not. Judge Thayer arranged them side by side. He didn't rush, neither did I. After nearly 10 minutes, he finally spoke. I'm ordering a preliminary forensic review. Relief didn't show on my face. Years in investigations had taught me never to celebrate before the paperwork cleared. I would also like to request, I said, that the court temporarily suspend any transfer involving estate assets until that review is complete. He reached for his pen. I believe that's reasonable. As he signed the order, he looked up. Captain, yes, Your Honor. If your grandfather trusted you enough to leave questions behind, I intend to find answers. Thank you. When I left Chambers, I felt something I hadn't experienced since returning home. Not victory, momentum. Outside the courthouse, I sat in my truck and opened my laptop. CID training doesn't disappear because you're on leave. It becomes habit. Every investigation starts the same way. Follow documented facts before chasing theories. Whitney's fiancé, Nathan Caldwell, introduced himself as a commercial real estate consultant. Consultants leave paper trails. George's campaign donations, corporate registrations, and business filings were publicly available. So were many property transactions. Within 30 minutes, I'd mapped Nathan's business partnerships over the past 3 years. Most were ordinary, one wasn't. A consulting company named Harbor Ridge Advisory, tiny, recently formed. Only one employee listed Nathan. Interesting. I kept digging. Another public filing connected Harbor Ridge Advisory to a regional title company involved in commercial property acquisitions. Still legal, still ordinary. Then I searched county payment disclosures connected to licensed notaries working on high-value transactions. One familiar name appeared, Linda Greer, the same notary listed on Grandpa's supposed November will. I requested publicly available payment records connected to one commercial closing. Nothing unusual. Then another. Still nothing. Finally, one electronic transfer caught my attention. November 14. The exact date printed on the will. Harbor Ridge Advisory had transferred exactly 10,000 thousands to Linda Greer. The payment description read consulting services. I stared at the screen. Maybe there was a perfectly innocent explanation. Consultants hire consultants all the time. Notaries also perform administrative work. None of that was illegal. Timing, however, matters, especially when money changes hands on the exact day a $27 million estate supposedly changed direction. I downloaded the filing, saved 3 backup copies, recorded the document identification number. Then I closed the laptop. Evidence first, conclusions later. As I started the engine, I couldn't help thinking about another family dispute I'd come across years earlier. That case began with a single suspicious payment and ended somewhere nobody expected. If stories like this keep you wondering how far people will go when money replaces loyalty, watch for the recommendation that appears in the top right corner of your screen between minutes 45 and 55. The truth in that one may surprise you even more than this one did. I shut my laptop, printed 1 copy of the payment record, and locked the original files inside an encrypted drive before heading back to the estate. By the time I turned onto the long gravel driveway, the house looked strangely quiet. Too quiet. The catering vans from the luncheon were gone. The expensive cars had disappeared. Only my father's pickup, Whitney's SUV, and my truck remained. That usually meant one thing. The audience had gone home. Now came the private performance. I carried my duffel upstairs, changed into a plain gray t-shirt and jeans, and spent nearly an hour rereading Grandpa's journal. His handwriting steadied me. Every page reminded me that patience wasn't passive. It was discipline. Around 8:40 that evening, someone knocked twice, not politely, deliberately. I opened my bedroom door. Whitney stood there. "Dad wants to see you." "About what?" "The library." "That's not an answer, sir." She smiled without warmth. "You'll find out." I followed her downstairs. The estate library had once been Grandpa's favorite room. Floor-to-ceiling walnut shelves lined the walls. Old maps of Georgia timber roots hung in brass frames. The smell of leather bindings and cedar still lingered despite everything that had happened. Grandpa had built this room to think. Tonight it had been arranged to negotiate. Franklin sat behind the massive mahogany desk. A single banker-style lamp illuminated 3 documents placed neatly in front of him. Beside the papers rested a check. Whitney closed the library door behind me. The click of the latch echoed through the room. Dad gestured toward the empty chair. "Sit down, I'll stand," he sighed. "You're making this harder than it needs to be." "I doubt that." Whitney walked around the desk and tapped 1 finger against the check. "I wanted to solve this quietly. I noticed. It's generous." I glanced down. "Pay to the order of Kendall Albright. Amount, 50,000. Her signature already appeared across the bottom. The memo line read, "Family settlement." Interesting choice of words. "I've made more money than that in 1 real estate closing," Whitney said. "This is my peace offering." "No, it's a good offer." "No, you haven't even heard the rest." "I don't need to." Dad leaned forward. "Hear your sister out." Whitney slid the first document toward me. Simple non-disclosure agreement. The second, formal waiver of every future claim involving Grandpa's estate. The third, mutual confidentiality. I skimmed the pages. Standard legal formatting, professional drafting. Someone had invested real money preparing these documents. 1 clause immediately caught my attention. By signing, I would acknowledge that I had no reason to question the authenticity of the current will. Another required me to refrain from communicating with any government agency regarding estate matters. Interesting. Very interesting. I looked back up. "Who drafted these?" "Our attorney, Mr. Ellis." Whitney hesitated for barely half a second. No, that answer mattered. If the family's own probate attorney refused to prepare them, someone else had. Franklin folded his arms. "You're overthinking everything." "That's literally my profession." He ignored the comment. "If you sign tonight, everyone moves on." "I've already moved on." "You know what I mean." "I do." Whitney crossed her arms. "You've embarrassed this family enough." I corrected a false statement. "You humiliated Mom. She accused me of extortion. You could have handled that privately." I wasn't the one speaking into a microphone. Silence settled between us. Whitney changed tactics. "You've got a military career." "Yes." "You've worked hard for it." "Yes." "It would be a shame if all this unnecessary drama started raising questions about your judgment." There it was. I looked at her. "Go on." She smiled slightly. "You hold a security clearance." "I do. Investigations happen." "They do. People making public accusations against their own families don't always look stable." I almost laughed. Instead, I asked the question she wasn't expecting. Have you ever completed a federal background investigation? She blinked. No, I have. Neither she nor Dad interrupted. They're based on documented facts. I let that sentence settle. Not family gossip. Whitney's smile disappeared. Dad leaned forward again. We're trying to protect you. No, we are. You're trying to protect yourselves. His jaw tightened. You've always thought you're smarter than everyone else. No, then stop acting like an investigator. I am an investigator. The room fell quiet again. Whitney pushed the check closer. Take the $50,000. No, nobody has to know. I would. You'd rather spend years fighting this. I'd rather spend one day telling the truth. Dad slammed one hand against the desk. Enough. The lamp rattled. You've already gone to the judge. Neither Whitney nor I reacted. Interesting. He wasn't asking. He knew. So that's what this is really about, I said. Franklin immediately realized what he'd revealed. You've been snooping, Whitney snapped. No, I looked at Dad. You've been worrying. Nobody spoke. He looked away first. Another observation, another small piece. Whitney grabbed the check and held it toward me. This is your last chance. I accepted it. She smiled. For exactly 1 second. I looked carefully at the amount, the signature, the routing numbers. Then I placed it back on the desk, not careless, deliberately. I slid it across the polished mahogany until it stopped directly in front of her. She frowned. I don't think you understand what you're refusing. I met her eyes. My voice never rose above a whisper. You spent $50,000 on a check, Whitney. Neither of them moved. I spent 10 years learning exactly what forgery looks like under a microscope. The room became perfectly still. I nudged the check the last inch toward her. Keep your paper. Whitney's face drained of color. Dad stared at me without speaking. For the first time since I'd returned home, neither of them looked confident. They looked uncertain. And uncertainty makes people careless. I turned toward the library door. Franklin spoke behind me. If you walk out, don't expect this family to forgive you. I rested one hand on the brass doorknob before answering. I stopped asking for forgiveness from people who never apologized. Then I walked upstairs. When I reached my bedroom, I locked the door and laid out my Army service uniform across the bed. Jacket, trousers, white shirt, black tie, bronze star, CID badge, Captain silver rank insignia. Tomorrow wasn't just another court hearing. It was an official legal proceeding, and I intended to appear exactly as I had built my career, prepared, disciplined, and impossible to intimidate. I woke before my alarm, sat on the edge of the bed for a few seconds, and looked at the Army service uniform laid out exactly where I'd left it. My mother had been in my room while I slept. I knew because there was a plain black dress folded neatly across the foot of the bed. A small note rested on top. Wear this today. Don't embarrass the family. No signature. None was necessary. I picked up the note, folded it once, and dropped it into the trash can. Then I lifted the dress and hung it back inside the closet. Not out of anger, just because it wasn't mine. The uniform was. I filled the old iron with water from the bathroom sink and plugged it in. While it warmed, I checked each item one final time. White shirt, black tie, blue Army service coat, matching trousers, black dress shoes polished until they reflected the ceiling light. My CID investigator badge rested inside its small protective case. Beside it lay my Bronze Star medal, silver captain's bars, nameplate, service ribbons. Everything had its place. Military life teaches something that civilian life often forgets. Details are never just details. They become habits. Habits become character. I pressed the shirt first. Every crease disappeared beneath slow, steady strokes. No rushing, no shortcuts. The same method I'd used before promotion boards, military funerals, and official investigations. The uniform deserved respect because of what it represented, not because anyone else happened to be looking. As I attached my ribbons, my phone vibrated. Judge Carlton Thayer. I answered immediately. Good morning, Your Honor. I wanted to let you know the preliminary forensic examiner will be present today. Thank you. And Captain? Yes, sir. I also granted your request. I already knew which request he meant. The safe? Yes, it has been transferred from the court vault. I closed my eyes for just a moment. Grandpa's note had brought me this far. Today, we'd learn why. The hearing begins at 10. I'll be there. After we hung up, I opened the small velvet box holding Grandpa's dog tags. I didn't put them around my neck. Instead, I slipped them into the inside pocket of my uniform coat, close enough to feel their weight, not visible enough to distract from the purpose of the day. I wasn't attending court as a grieving granddaughter alone. I was attending as an officer sworn to respect evidence wherever it led. Downstairs, dishes clinked against porcelain. Breakfast had started. I carried my duffel downstairs wearing only the pressed trousers and white shirt. The coat remained over my arm. My mother looked up first. Oh, that single word carried unmistakable disappointment. I left you something more appropriate. I saw it. You should wear it. I'm not. Whitney looked over the rim of her coffee cup. Trying to impress the judge? No. Dad folded his newspaper. This isn't a military hearing. I know. You don't need to play soldier. I buttered a piece of toast before answering. I've never played. The room went quiet. Whitney shook her head. You always have to make everything dramatic. I haven't raised my voice once. Mom placed her coffee cup down a little harder than necessary. People will stare. They usually do. Franklin leaned back. You'll look ridiculous. I smiled politely. The army has survived worse. Whitney laughed. You really think wearing medals changes anything? No. What then? It reminds me who earned the right to wear them. Nobody answered. I finished breakfast in silence. At 8:47, I stood and carried the uniform coat into Grandpa's old study. The door was unlocked for the first time since I'd come home. Interesting. Most of the shelves were empty now. Boxes lined one wall. His desk remained untouched. I stood in front of the mirror he'd installed decades earlier. Slowly, I slipped on the coat. Then came the routine my hands could perform without conscious thought. Captain's bars, perfect alignment. Nameplate, exactly centered. Service ribbons, measured spacing, side badge, locked firmly into place. Finally, the bronze star. I adjusted it once, twice, a fraction of an inch. Perfect. People sometimes think uniforms exist to impress others. They're wrong. A properly worn uniform reminds the person inside it that standards still matter, especially when nobody else seems interested in having any. I picked up Grandpa's journal from my duffel. You were right, I said quietly. The room, of course, offered no reply. It didn't need to. Everything he wanted me to know was already written. I returned the journal to my bag and walked toward the front staircase. Voices drifted up from below. Whitney was laughing. Dad sounded relaxed again. Apparently last night's failed negotiation had restored his confidence. Maybe he believed the courtroom would be another place where money carried more weight than facts. Maybe he thought I'd appear as the same daughter they'd ignored for years. He was about to learn otherwise. My shoes struck the hardwood one step at a time. The conversation downstairs stopped before I reached the halfway point. Whitney looked up first. Her smile disappeared. Mom slowly lowered her coffee cup onto the table. Franklin turned. For a moment, nobody spoke. I wasn't wearing combat gear. I wasn't carrying a weapon. Just a perfectly prepared Army service uniform worn exactly as regulations required. But something changed in the room. The daughter they'd ordered to move furniture had vanished. In her place stood a commissioned officer whose career had been built on facts, discipline, and accountability. Dad's face lost its color so quickly it almost looked painful. His shoulders stiffened. His confident expression collapsed into something I'd never seen on him before. Recognition, not of rank, not of medals, of authority he couldn't control. Whitney finally broke the silence. Seriously? I adjusted one glove inside my pocket. Yes. Mom found her voice. Take that off. No. This is a family matter. It's a legal matter. Dad stood. You think that uniform gives you power? I picked up my keys from the entry table. No. He waited. It reminds people that I already accept responsibility for my actions long before I walked into this house. Nobody followed me. As I opened the front door, the morning air was cool. The courthouse waited less than 20 minutes away. Behind me, I heard nothing except the front door slowly closing on a family that still believed appearances could manufacture the truth. Ahead of me waited a courtroom where appearances carried no legal weight at all. I parked outside the courthouse, locked my truck, and walked through the front entrance without looking toward the growing crowd gathered on the courthouse steps. Reporters recognized my last name before they recognized my face. Cassandra News Network, Captain Albright. Is it true you're contesting your grandfather's will? Do you believe fraud was committed? Camera shutters clicked in rapid bursts. I kept walking. CE teaches you an important lesson during public investigations. Never argue with microphones. Inside, the courthouse buzzed with quiet conversations. Lawyers moved between courtrooms carrying thick case files. Families sat on wooden benches waiting for hearings that would change their lives. Unlike the country club, nobody here cared about designer watches or social status. Only records. Only testimony, only evidence. Courtroom 3 was already nearly full. I paused just inside the doorway. The front rows were occupied by local reporters. Behind them sat several members of the Magnolia Crest Country Club, including nearly everyone who had applauded my father's announcement 2 days earlier. Apparently, public humiliation attracted just as much attention as public celebration. Whitney sat beside Nathan at the plaintiff's table. She wore another expensive white suit. Nathan leaned close enough to whisper something that made her smile. Franklin sat beside two corporate attorneys I had never met before. Both wore tailored charcoal suits and the relaxed expressions of men who believed paperwork had already won the case. My mother avoided looking at me. Judge Carlton Thayer entered exactly on schedule. All rise. Everyone stood. The courtroom settled into silence as he took his seat. You may be seated. The clerk reviewed the probate matter before the judge looked toward Franklin's legal team. Counsel, the older attorney, stood first. Your Honor, my name is Robert Gaines, representing the estate through Ms. Whitney Albright. Judge Thayer nodded. You may proceed. Mr. Gaines walked toward the center of the courtroom carrying the November will. This matter is considerably simpler than opposing counsel would have the court believe. I almost smiled. There was no opposing counsel. I had chosen to represent myself regarding the factual issues I'd raised. That seemed to surprise him. He continued. The decedent exercised his unquestionable legal right to distribute his property as he saw fit. He held up the will. The document was properly witnessed. He turned one page, properly notarized, another page, and properly executed. He looked directly at the judge. The petitioner has offered nothing beyond speculation motivated by disappointment. The second attorney stood. If I may add, Your Honor. Judge Thayer nodded again. Our client understands these allegations are emotionally driven. He glanced briefly toward me. Captain Albright spent much of her adult life away from Georgia. True, she had limited involvement in the day-to-day operation of Mr. Albright's business. Also true. The deceased naturally relied upon Whitney Albright, who remained close to home. Whitney lowered her eyes modestly. The performance continued. It is therefore entirely reasonable that Mr. Albright would choose the granddaughter who demonstrated consistent family involvement. He paused for emphasis, rather than one facing financial instability due to a career in government service. A few people quietly shifted in their seats. Interesting. Government salary was now being presented as evidence of unworthiness. The attorney continued. The will reflects practical judgment, not affection, not loyalty, practical judgment. He returned to counsel's table with obvious confidence. Judge Thayer looked toward me. Captain Albright, I stood. Unlike the attorneys, I carried no leather briefcase. Only one organized document folder. Your Honor, you may proceed. I stepped to the podium. The wood felt smooth beneath my fingertips. I looked first at the judge, not at my family, not at the audience. Years of testimony had taught me where attention belonged. I'm not asking this court to redistribute property because my feelings were hurt. Complete silence. I'm asking the court to examine whether the document presented here accurately reflects my grandfather's intentions. Judge Thayer nodded slightly. I opened the folder. My first exhibit consists of authenticated signatures executed by Silas Everett Albright over a 6-year period. The bailiff delivered copies to the bench and opposing counsel. I continued. These include banking documents, business correspondence, holiday cards, and sworn affidavits. Mr. Gaines glanced through them. I placed an enlarged photograph beside the questioned signature. My grandfather suffered advanced arthritis. Judge Thayer already knew. The courtroom did not. That condition consistently affected pressure distribution across his signature. I pointed toward the enlargement. The questioned signature displays uniform pressure, altered spacing, and a measurable change in writing angle. The forensic examiner appointed by the court adjusted his glasses while studying the documents. I never claimed certainty, only observable facts. Those differences may have innocent explanations, Mr. Gaines smiled. Exactly. I nodded, which is why I requested independent forensic review rather than making accusations. His smile faded. I removed another document. Second, the bailiff distributed additional copies. This is a publicly documented electronic transfer. Nathan shifted in his chair. The movement was almost invisible, almost. The transfer occurred on November 14th. I allowed the date to settle over the courtroom. The same day the contested will was allegedly executed. Judge Thayer studied the page. I continued. The payer was Harbor Ridge Advisory, Nathan's consulting company. The recipient was Linda Greer. The courtroom clerk quietly looked toward the witness list. I finished the sentence. The notary whose signature appears on the questioned will. Mr. Gaines stood immediately. Objection. Judge Thayer looked up. State your grounds. Relevance. I answered before the judge could rule. I agree the payment alone proves nothing. Mr. Gaines looked surprised. I continued. Consulting relationships are legal. Judge Thayer leaned forward. So why present it? Because unexplained financial relationships between a beneficiary's fiancé and the notary responsible for validating a $27 million estate deserve examination. Silence. Real silence, not theatrical silence. The kind created when people begin reconsidering assumptions they'd accepted only minutes earlier. Judge Thayer reviewed the transfer again. $10,000. Yes, Your Honor. Description? Consulting services. He looked toward Nathan. Nathan looked toward his attorney. Nobody volunteered an explanation. The court-appointed forensic examiner finally cleared his throat. Your Honor. Judge Thayer turned. I've completed my preliminary comparison. Every head in the courtroom shifted toward him. In my professional opinion, there are sufficient inconsistencies between the question signature and known exemplars to justify a full forensic authentication. The room seemed to exhale all at once. Reporters immediately began writing. One camera quietly clicked. Mr. Gaines stopped taking notes. Judge Thayer closed the folder in front of him. Then he looked directly at me. Captain Albright. Yes, Your Honor. Does your request for additional review remain unchanged? It does. It includes the secure repository maintained by this court? Yes, sir. I reached into the inside pocket of my uniform jacket and rested my hand around the weight of Grandpa's brass key without removing it. My grandfather left instructions that anticipated exactly this possibility. For the first time that morning, Franklin's confident posture disappeared. His eyes locked onto my uniform pocket. Then, almost instinctively, he gripped the edge of counsel's table hard enough for his knuckles to turn white. He already knew what was coming. He just couldn't stop it anymore. I slowly removed my hand from my uniform pocket, feeling the weight of Grandpa's brass key before I placed it on the evidence table in front of Judge Thayer. I believe this belongs to the court, Your Honor. The courtroom became so quiet that I could hear someone in the back row stop typing. Judge Thayer looked down at the heavy brass key without touching it. Where did you obtain this? My grandfather left it for me inside his army footlocker, together with written instructions directing me to the secure safe maintained by this court. The judge studied my face for a moment. Do you possess those written instructions? I do. I handed the folded note to the bailiff, who carried it to the bench. Judge Thayer unfolded it carefully and read every line without interruption. When he finished, he placed it beside the key. Then he looked toward the courtroom clerk. The court will mark both items as exhibits. Franklin shot to his feet. Your Honor, I object. Judge Thayer looked at him. On what grounds? That safe is private family property. It has been under court custody for several years, the judge replied calmly. It still belongs to the estate, which is precisely why the court is responsible for determining its legal significance. Franklin's attorney quickly stood beside him. Your Honor, opening that safe serves no legitimate purpose. Judge Thayer folded his hands. Captain Albright has presented credible questions regarding the authenticity of the contested will. Mr. Gaines answered immediately. Questions, yes. Evidence of fraud, no. Judge Thayer nodded once, which is exactly why further examination is appropriate. Whitney leaned toward her father. He whispered something back too quietly for anyone else to hear. For the first time since the hearing began, neither of them looked composed. They looked frightened. Meredith suddenly stood. Her chair scraped loudly across the courtroom floor. This has gone far enough. Nobody responded. She pointed toward me. My daughter is manipulating everyone. Judge Thayer waited. That safe contains nothing important. She forced a nervous laugh. Just old military junk. Franklin quickly joined her. Exactly. He gestured impatiently. My father kept useless war souvenirs. He was sentimental. That's all this is. Several reporters exchanged curious looks. Interesting. If the safe truly contained nothing valuable, why were they both trying so desperately to keep it closed? Judge Thayer noticed the same contradiction. I don't recall anyone asking what was inside. Nobody answered. He looked toward the bailiffs. Retrieve the secure repository. Yes, Your Honor. 2 deputy bailiffs left through the side door. The courtroom remained silent while everyone waited. Nobody seemed interested in whispering anymore. Even the reporters stopped moving. Nearly 8 minutes later, the side doors opened again. The 2 deputies returned pushing a heavy steel evidence cart. Resting on top sat an antique black iron safe. It looked older than the courthouse itself. The paint had faded long ago. The thick hinges showed patches of surface rust. A brass evidence seal remained attached across the handle. Judge Thayer looked toward the clerk. Has the seal remained intact since transfer? Yes, Your Honor. No record of unauthorized access? None. He nodded. The deputies rolled the safe directly in front of the bench. I recognized it immediately. Grandpa had kept it in the corner of his study for years. As a little girl, I'd asked him why he never replaced it with a modern safe. He smiled. Because old steel remembers. I never understood what he meant. Until now. Franklin suddenly stepped forward. No. Every eye turned toward him. You can't open it. Judge Thayer raised an eyebrow. Explain. It's... Franklin searched for words. Private. The judge answered without emotion. Everything involved in probate is private until the court determines otherwise. Meredith's composure finally cracked. She stood beside Franklin. This is harassment. No, Judge Thayer replied. This is probate. She shook her head. My husband already told you. There are only useless war souvenirs inside. Her voice grew louder. Old uniforms, old medals, old papers. Nothing worth wasting the court's time. Whitney joined them. This is becoming a circus. Nathan finally spoke for the first time in nearly an hour. My fiancé has already inherited everything legally. Judge Thayer looked directly at him. Mr. Caldwell. Nathan straightened. Were you responsible for a $10,000 payment made to the notary on November 14th? Nathan froze. My attorney has advised me. I didn't ask what your attorney advised. Silence. Nathan said nothing. Judge Thayer turned back toward the safe. Captain Albright. Yes, Your Honor. Please approach. I stepped forward. The brass key rested where I'd left it. Judge Thayer extended his hand. The key. I picked it up. For just a second, I felt Grandpa's worn dog tags in my pocket. Then I placed the heavy brass key into the judge's open palm. He examined it carefully. No identifying marks. No, sir. He walked down from the bench himself. That surprised almost everyone. Judges rarely leave the bench during hearings unless something truly mattered. He stopped beside the antique safe. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath. The keyhole sat beneath a thick iron cover. Judge Thayer lifted the cover with one hand. Years of old metal groaned softly. He inserted the brass key. It fit perfectly. Franklin took one desperate step forward. You can't. Judge Thayer didn't even look back. Sit down. The authority in his voice ended the argument before it began. Franklin slowly lowered himself into his chair. His face had turned almost completely white. Judge Thayer wrapped both hands around the key. The mechanism resisted at first. Then came a heavy metallic sound. One turn, another. A loud internal click echoed through the courtroom. The lock I released, no one moved. The judge pulled the thick iron door open. Its hinges complained after years of remaining closed. Inside sat only 3 items: an American flag folded into a perfect triangle, a small wooden military presentation box, and beneath both, a large envelope edged in deep red. Judge Thayer lifted it carefully. The seal remained unbroken. Across the front appeared Grandpa's unmistakable handwriting, to be opened only under judicial authority. Below that, another line: executed while of sound mind and physical health under military legal supervision. Judge Thayer turned the envelope over. The back carried multiple signatures: military witnesses, official certification, dates from years before Grandpa's final illness. The courtroom had been waiting all morning for answers. Instead, the old soldier had left something even more powerful: proof that he had expected this day long before anyone else realized it was coming. I watched Judge Thayer hold the red-bordered envelope for several quiet seconds before he carefully broke the seal. Nobody in the courtroom moved. Not the reporters, not the attorneys, not even my father. The only sound came from the paper unfolding in the judge's hands. He adjusted his glasses and looked down at the first page. This document identifies itself as the last will and testament of Silas Everett Albright. He paused. It was executed under military legal supervision on March 18, 6 years prior to Mr. Albright's death. The courtroom clerk verified the attached certifications. Military witnesses are identified. Judge Thayer continued. The execution documents include competency affidavits signed by attending physicians, Another page. The court also notes that this instrument predates the onset of the medical condition later affecting Mr. Albright's handwriting. Franklin stood halfway from his chair. This is ridiculous. Judge Thayer never looked up. Sit down. Franklin remained standing. My father replaced that document. Judge Thayer calmly lifted another sheet from the envelope. According to this notarized declaration, Mr. Albright specifically anticipated that future documents might appear claiming to replace this will. Silence settled over the room. The judge read aloud. If any instrument is presented that substantially alters my intent while excluding the judicial repository established for this document, I request that such instrument receive immediate forensic review. Every reporter in the room began writing at once. I didn't look at my family. I didn't need to. I could almost feel their confidence disappearing. Judge Thayer turned another page. The dispositive provisions are clear. He looked toward the courtroom. I hereby leave 90% of my estate, including the Albright timberlands, the historic family residence, all controlling ownership interests in Albright Timber Holdings, and the continuing stewardship of the Albright family name to the Albright Conservation Trust. He paused. The trust shall be administered exclusively by my granddaughter, Captain Kendall Marie Albright. No applause. No whispers. Only stunned silence. The judge continued. My son, Franklin Albright, shall receive no controlling interest in any protected timberland. Another page. Any personal debts, guarantees, investments liabilities, or corporate obligations incurred independently by Franklin Albright shall remain his sole legal responsibility. I finally looked toward my father. The color had disappeared from his. He wasn't staring at me. He was staring at the will, like a man watching an entire future disappear one sentence at a time. Whitney slowly shook her head. No. It barely sounded like a word. Judge Thayer wasn't finished. My granddaughter, Whitney Albright, shall receive a fixed educational and charitable trust distribution, contingent upon her cooperation with the lawful administration of this estate. Whitney whispered again. No, the amount was generous, but it was nowhere near $27 million. More importantly, she controlled nothing. Nathan closed his eyes. His business plan had just collapsed in front of a room full of witnesses. Judge Thayer placed the final page onto the bench. The court finds substantial evidence requiring immediate suspension of the November instrument pending criminal investigation. Franklin finally found his voice. This is a setup. Judge Thayer looked directly at him. No. He picked up the forensic report. This is documentation. The courtroom doors opened behind us. 2 investigators entered with a woman I immediately recognized, Linda Greer, the notary. She looked nothing like the confident professional whose signature appeared on the November will. One investigator approached the bench. Your Honor. Judge Thayer nodded. The investigator turned toward Linda. Ma'am, you're under arrest pursuant to a federal warrant charging wire fraud, conspiracy, and forgery related to probate documents. Gasps spread across the courtroom. Linda closed her eyes. She didn't resist. As the investigators placed handcuffs around her wrists, she quietly said something none of us expected. I told them this would never survive an audit. Nobody answered. She looked once toward Nathan, then toward Franklin. Neither man met her eyes. The investigators escorted her toward the hallway. Before disappearing through the courtroom doors, she spoke one last sentence. It wasn't worth $10,000. The doors closed. Nobody moved. Judge Thayer looked toward the clerk. The court directs certified copies of today's proceedings to the United States Attorney's Office and the appropriate federal investigative agencies. Franklin grabbed the edge of the counsel table. You can't charge us, Judge Thayer answered calmly. I can't. He nodded toward the investigators still standing near the rear of the courtroom. They can. One federal agent stepped forward. Mr. Franklin Albright. Another turned toward Meredith. Mrs. Meredith Albright. The lead agent opened a folder. You are both advised to retain legal counsel regarding an ongoing federal investigation involving alleged wire fraud, estate forgery, and related financial offenses. Meredith stared at him. No, the word came out almost as a whisper. Franklin tried speaking. Nothing came. His mouth opened. No sound followed. For the first time in my life, I saw my father without an answer, without control, without anyone left to blame. Meredith reached for his arm. Instead of finding support, she found someone barely standing himself. Her knees gave way first. She collapsed onto the polished courtroom floor. Franklin instinctively reached toward her. His balance disappeared. A second later, he fell beside her. The courtroom erupted into motion. Paramedics already assigned to the courthouse hurried forward. Someone called for water. Someone else cleared space. Judge Thayer remained seated. He'd seen enough courtrooms to know that consequences often arrived without warning. Whitney dropped into her chair. The confidence she'd worn all week vanished. Mascara streaked down her face as she buried it in both hands. I didn't think. She never finished the sentence. Nathan quietly stepped away from her, not dramatically, just one careful step, then another. By the time she looked up, he was already walking toward the exit with his attorney. He never looked back. I remained where I was until the bailiff approached, carrying Grandpa's old army footlocker. Captain, he handed it to me. The court believes this belongs with you. I accepted it with both hands. The familiar weight felt different now. Not heavier, lighter, because I finally understood it had never been an inheritance measured by dollars. It was trust. Judge Thayer looked at me before the hearing officially concluded. Captain Albright, your grandfather chose well. I nodded once. Thank you. Then I walked toward the courtroom doors. Nobody tried to stop me. Nobody ordered me to carry furniture. Nobody asked me to stay quiet for the family's reputation. Outside, the afternoon sun reflected across the courthouse steps. The felt cleaner than it had when I arrived. I adjusted the footlocker under one arm and walked toward my truck without looking back. I spent my entire youth believing that loyalty was measured by how much of myself I was willing to erase to keep my family comfortable. I wore their silence like a heavy winter coat, letting them believe I was small, because I was terrified of finding out whether they would still recognize my face if I didn't hide my strength. I went to war to protect their freedom, and I returned to find that the only thing they wanted to secure was my inheritance. But the courtroom floor taught me a lesson that no combat deployment ever could. Unconditional sacrifice without boundaries is not humility. It is an invitation to entitlement. When you allow the people who raised you to treat your existence as a transaction and your dignity as an asset, you are not being a good daughter. You are simply building the very cage they keep you in. My father measured human worth by the height of an office tower, the luster of a diamond necklace, or the convenience of a forged signature. He could not see the steel inside his own daughter because his hands had only ever learned to grip things that came with a price tag. But true honor cannot be bought at a surplus store, and respect is not a currency you can extort over an estate dinner. The medals on my uniform were earned in rooms they would have been too frightened to stand in. But it was the quiet boundary I drew on a Thursday morning that finally set me free. We do not owe our silence to keep our abusers warm. Sometimes the most loving, dignified thing you can do is to stop holding up a roof that was built to crush you, set the weight down, and walk out into the clean, honest light. Before I leave you with the lesson this journey taught me, take a moment to watch the story waiting on your screen. It's one of the channel's most unforgettable family revenge stories. And if this case kept you thinking about truth, loyalty, and consequences, that one will stay with you long after it ends.